Hi everyone, in this video I want to talk about fallacies of presumption, ambiguity, and grammatical analogy. The first fallacy we want to talk about is begging the question, also known as circular argument. This is an argument in which the person assumes what they are supposed to be proving, what they portray themselves as proving. So, for example, if someone just has a premise that actually restates their conclusion, but maybe in different words, then that's an example of circular argument. So for example, someone says, God wants us to eat animals. And you ask, well, how do we know that God wants us to eat animals? And the person says, well, because when God put animals on this earth, the intention was for us to eat them. And you can immediately see why this is called circular argument, right? Because the premise is really just the conclusion. So then when you ask for a reason to believe the conclusion, you're getting the conclusion again. You can also have an argument where the premise doesn't exactly just restate the conclusion, but it would be impossible to know the premise without already knowing the conclusion ahead of time. So someone gives an argument like, we can prove that God exists, and you say, well, really, how do we know God exists? They say, well, it says in the Bible that God exists. And the Bible's a document God left behind as evidence of his existence. And so this is, of course, I didn't just say God exists because the supreme being exists or something like that. But when I say the Bible's a document God left behind as evidence of his existence, this is something that I would have to first believe that God existed to believe that he left this document behind. So um, I'm relying on already knowing the conclusion rather than giving some kind of independent reason to believe the conclusion. So again, that's a circular argument. And sometimes there can be some intermediate steps before we get to the premise that really is just the conclusion or relies on the conclusion. So, like for example, somebody says, the poem Beowulf is a portrayal of standard societal beliefs of its day. And if you ask, really, how do we know that that poem does that? And the person says, well, because it's an epic poem, it's classified as an epic poem, and that's something epic poems do. And then you ask, okay, why do we classify it as an epic poem? And they say, well, because it depicts the normal societal beliefs of its time. Um, I'm going in a circle, but there's a few intermediate steps before I get back around to the beginning of the circle again. Um, rather than having some independent way of identifying it as an epic poem, I use the feature that I claim to be concluding about it on the basis of its being an epic poem. Hence the circular reasoning. You may hear the term begging the question used incorrectly. It's very commonly used to mean raising the question, which is not really what the original meaning of begging the question is. So you'll see on the news, like interviewers, so, Mr. Dahmer, that begs the question. Where did you hide the bodies or something? Then they ask a question. So they're using it to mean raises the question, and okay, whatever. The meanings of words and phrases change over time, um, but I think it's still considered incorrect to use begging the question in that way. What it really means is a circular argument, because you're assuming that the question has been answered in your favor, hence the name begging the question, rather than raising it. Um, the only exception that I would put on this, if you have a conclusion that is self-evident, then we don't consider this type of reasoning necessarily to be a fallacy. Whether some kind of circular argument is involved in self-evident conclusions or not, the point is that there might not be much else you can say about certain ideas as evidence than to sort of repeat them in a different way. So, for example, if I'm challenged to justify why 2 plus 2 is 4, that's something I might not be able to do in a non-circular way. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that should be rejected as an unacceptable premise. So I say, well, I might have to say, hold up 2 fingers, this 1, 2, hold up another 2 fingers, and then say, well, see, count them all, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now somebody could say, right, well, isn't that's circular reasoning? Because really, you're just restating that 2 plus 2 is 4 when you do that thing with your fingers, which I suppose is true. But we have this kind of case where we don't consider it a fallacy if you have something that's self-evident like that. Just restating it maybe the only sort of thing you can do to make it more obvious that it's self-evident. A complex question is an argument that takes the form of a question. And so there's a really easy way to look out for this fallacy in the examples in the book and the exams. Look for a question mark, right? If anytime you see a question mark, consider whether the question is complex. To ask a complex question means that you essentially suggest a range of possible answers. Very commonly, it's going to be yes or no. So the person sort of implicitly, through conversation or maybe directly, insists that the potential answers to the question are just yes and no. And it's a question like where either answer would be misleading and or false. So I ask, tell me, have you quit smoking crack yet? And so if you say, yes, I quit smoking crack, that means you used to smoke crack, so you're admitting to smoking crack. If you say, no, I haven't quit smoking crack, then, then I'm going to jump on that and say, ha, so he still smokes crack. And, right, that's misleading. Maybe there is a correct yes or no answer. Technically speaking, if you never smoked crack in the first place, then you don't have to quit smoking crack. So you could say, no, I haven't quit smoking crack. And technically that would be, I hope for everyone out there, that would be your correct response. But it would be misleading, right? If you just had that conversation in front of others and you said, someone said, have you quit smoking crack? And you said, no, I have not. And just left it at that. Well, that's going to be misleading, right? So there are other cases where someone suggests the suggested answers could be more than 2, although typically it's sort of just it's just 2. Most common example is a yes or no question. False dichotomy is essentially the same thing as complex question to my mind. You can get debate about this between different textbooks and so on. But in a false dichotomy, rather than in the form of a question, a range of options is specified in a statement. And here, usually the range of options is 2. In fact, the name false dichotomy implies that there would be 2 options specified. Actually, I think that's really just a special case of of specifying a range of options, and it really could be any number of options, although typically it's going to be 2. And it's not really true that that's all the options. That's what makes it a fallacy. A lot of times a person offers these 2 alternatives as your potential responses, and they're extreme. They're on extreme ends of a spectrum where really there could be various intermediate possibilities, and the person is just sort of insisting insisting on one of the extremes, or pretending that the intermediate options don't exist. So, for example, Someone makes the argument, um, either you either you accept America exactly as it is and don't complain about it, or else you should just leave the country. You should just go somewhere else. You hear this kind of statement being made, and of course, there are other options other than just accepting everything as it is and just moving somewhere else. You can remain here, but continue to voice your opinion about the things that are problematic, right? So it's often a way of trying to sort of just force a one of two extremes. Um, so it can be a deliberate kind of thing, or it can be something. It can be something that's more a question of overlooking those possibilities rather than something deliberate. Another example of a false dichotomy is a case where someone says, either you're with me or you're my enemy, right? And that's a classic sort of false dichotomy statement, as if neutrality is not a possibility, when of course typically it is. It's not to say that there couldn't be cases where to be neutral would mean siding with the enemy essentially somehow, right? There could be such cases, but it's considered we consider it the fallacy of false dichotomy when someone declares these are the options, and it's not clear that those really are the only options, when there's a strong possibility of some other options being the right one, or at least being available. So it could be that all the specified options are false, or it could just be that there's definitely a potential for some other kind of option. So complex question and false dichotomy are essentially the same thing. One's in the form of a question, the other in the form of a statement.